Listen to us. Our second speaker, Ms. Canan Bolel. She is from. She studied in Sabancı University, graduated in 2011. Again, in the political science, she has a master's degree in the same department. And in London Schools of Economics, she completed another master's degree. 1847-1923 thesis was her PhD on University of Washington on the at the moment at the Koç University Anatolian Civilization Research Center. She's carrying out PhD degrees, and in her speech she will be talking about Jewish bodies, missionary activities, tracing marginal spaces of 19th century Izmir in the Scottish missionary records. And again, you have 20 minutes.
Okay, hello everyone. Researcher working on Izmir, I will be talking about Scottish missionary activities in the city towards the local Jews, as I focus on the missionary spatial narrative. Okay. Is this better? Yeah. Okay. I'll start again. So, hello everyone. Merhaba. And today, as an Izmir researcher working on Izmir, I will be talking about Scottish missionary activities in the city towards the local Jews. And I will be focusing on the missionary spatial narratives of the city and also their mobility within the city, their accessibilities and inaccessibilities. So also this talk can be listened as an alternative to the grand narrative of cosmopolitanism in Izmir. In other words, the less fortunate individuals who were left out of this legend of cosmopolitanism, or a grim story of the so-called the Little Paris of the Levant. In fact, my interest in the Scottish missionary archives is part of my dissertation project, in which I focus on the politics of exclusion towards the marginal Jews of Izmir within their own community during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And by marginal, I mean the diseased, the poor, the criminal, and of course the newly converts to Christianity. And it is always a challenge to trace the experiences of the members of the lower classes in historical records in the archives. So therefore, in addition to archival materials from Ottoman archives and Israeli archives, I use Scottish missionary archives as an entrance point to the micro-histories of these individuals which were ignored, muted, or distorted within time. And during the 19th century, numbering around 40,000, Jews of Izmir formed the third largest Jewish community empire, following Salonika and Istanbul. And they were active participants in Izmir's rise to prominence as a Mediterranean port city beginning in the 17th century. Whereas even in the times of Izmir's growing prosperity, Jews remained numerous among the city's poor and working class, as their status worsened due to episodes of warfare, fires, earthquakes, and epidemics. And communal charity was there, and it was the main instrument to assist the poor, and it was based on Jewish religious commandments, and the politics of benevolence was quite complicated. The rich Jews, also known as Francos, were the main funders of the poor relief, and they felt entitled to involve in the local discussions surrounding the Jewish poor. As a reaction to the secular and religious authority figures of the community, Jews turned to another group for help, Scottish missionaries. And the year 1847 marked a breaking point for the Jewish community of Izmir. And one of the most important episodes of poor rebellion in the history of Izmir was brought under light by an Izmirli historian, Avner Levi, born in Karşıyaka in 1942, as he continued his studies in Jerusalem, Kudüs, and focused on an anonymous pamphlet titled Shavad Anim, Cry of the Poor, it can be translated into English. And it was published in 1847 in Izmir. Centered on the question of Gabela, the text on the kosher meat, a serious dispute between the rich and the poor of the Jewish community erupted and lasted for 2 years. As the rich and the rabbis insisted on increasing the tax, the poor preferred to eat non-kosher meat rather than paying it. The conflict took a new phase as 80 Jews and their families converted to Christianity. And over the course of the writing of Shavatanim, 2,000 more Izmirli Jews were in the process of conversion to Protestantism. The pamphlet ends with a warm salutation to Tanzimat, which also paved the way for an active period of missionary activities in the empire and of course in Izmir. Another Israeli historian, Yaron Ben Naeh, states that, and also can be seen from the example I just gave, in the Ottoman context, the Jewish culture of poverty was directly linked with transgression of religious commandments and communal regulations. Lower classes of the community, due to financial difficulties, had to work on Sabbath, ate non-kosher food, and stop studying the Torah. And due to alienation they experienced in their community, they became closer to Christian missionaries. And in the most extreme form, they converted to Christianity and were baptized. And throughout the 19th century, mission agencies gave importance to Izmir as an imperial port city within their Mediterranean network. In the aftermath of the Crimean Wars, and especially in 1856, the American Board of Commissioners for Turkey left, and the Church of Scotland took up stations in Izmir and Salonika. And settlements in Alexandria, Hasköy, Istanbul, and Beirut were followed in the coming years. And today I will focus mostly on the records of the Home and Foreign, records of the Church of Scotland, and also Dr. and Reverend Prinsky Scott's writings, who ran the Scottish Hospital in Izmir until 1892, which is also known as the Beaconsfield Memorial Hospital. The hospital is the key actor in the study, in my study, since it enabled Scottish missionaries to move beyond the accessible public spaces and spheres and involve in the private lives of the local Jews by entering their households and dwellings. In medical missions in general, the act of healing was understood both in physical and spiritual terms, and the Jewish body was at the center. Therefore, the narratives of Izmirli Jews in the Scottish missionary literature focused on the urgency of a European, a Christian intervention on their behalf. On a theological basis, this intervention was justified through Christians' obligation towards Jews, with a strong belief in that the Jesus of Nazareth is the eternal glory of the Jewish race. And this urgency to save Jewish bodies had a popular literary backing since early 1820s in the European popular writings such as travel memoirs, as they depicted the poor Jews of Izmir as the contaminated and the contaminating, the lower bodily strata of the city, and was increasingly becoming linked with disease, especially cholera. Especially the Jewish quarter was depicted with its high humidity, lack of fresh air flow, overpopulation, existence of fire-burnt buildings, and cemeteries next to habitations. Scottish missionaries, on the other hand, in line with the romanticism of the medical missions, depicted Jews as simple and easily affected by kindness. And they didn't mention on their racial difficulties, which were practiced by the European travel writers. And without pointing out a specific offender, Scottish missionaries strongly believed that Jews' centuries-long oppression continued in the Ottoman realm, and the Jewish quarter was the marginal space which needed to be saved. Then we can ask, how did Scottish missionaries observe Izmir upon their arrival and its particular spaces during the 19th century? Izmir has always, as I mentioned, has been always an important locale for Christians due to the history of the 7 churches and the residence of Apostle John. Whereas Scottish missionaries' first impression of Izmir was not favorable, and as a mission station it was perceived as difficult and not desirable due to long hot summers, frequent episodes of epidemics, and distance from Edinburgh. All in all, it was an Oriental city in the eyes of the Scots, and it was full of surprise and mystery, and they were not eager to destroy this image, this Oriental image, easily. For example, on his first sight of the Turkish Port Authority, the soldier, I guess, in full attire, Reverend Scott resembles him to a porcupine, with knives and pistols which seem to be growing out of his stomach. Other than the attires, rough, narrow streets of the city were strange and like labyrinth for them, as missionaries looked for some open space or a square persistently. Izmir was an outlandish and sometimes inexplicable place, especially for the Reverend Scott. He says briefly, "Our new surroundings seemed strange. They were awakened early in the morning by, again, strange sounds of vendors. They even resembled to sounds of vendors calling out their products to phrases, Johnny Scott, or Shake the Lady. These were wandering vendors selling and shouting the name of their products, either lamb liver, fish, milk, or garlic. And probably what they heard as Shake the Lady was a man yelling out, Şekerci geldi." And while the troops of camels coming into the port from the interior was the greatest proof that it was the land of the East, and in partial wilderness, the outskirts of the city were seen as part of nature, and Scottish missionaries enjoyed taking long walks in the Jewish cemetery, which extended along the hill towards the Lazaretto. The view was likened to Swiss Alps. Furthermore, as the burial ground was accessible to them, they also watched Jewish burial ceremonies and took notes just like an anthropologist. Another public place, the Bazaar, was a great pleasure as the missionaries were delighted both with common goods such as boots, fabrics, spoons. They were also fascinated by diamonds and pearls. And regarding transportation, tramways and railways were sources of relief with the mobility it offered to them. And neighborhoods of Bornova and Buca were also appreciated by the missionaries, as missionary Andrew Bonar in 1839 describes Buca as a beautiful village, much frequented by English residents, houses built apart with beautiful gardens, in contrast to overcrowded quarters of the Jews and Muslims, and they were aesthetically more favorable in the eye of the missionaries. In addition to the public spaces I've mentioned briefly, Scots felt at home at other missionary holdings and worked together on many instances, such as joint worship service with the American missionaries in the Dutch consulate. And although they had great mobility within the city, they had relatively more complicated relationship with other spaces. Synagogues, as expected, were not accessible by the missionaries. Although those were closed spaces, prisons were not. In the cases in which newly Christian converts were put in Turkish prisons, both missionaries and council members had access to prisons. And also it is interesting to see that through personal connections, prisons were relatively accessible. An interesting example this time comes from female British missionaries' memoir. On an August day in 1885, a man called Simon, the chief of brigands, was taken, shot, and beheaded. And his head was stuck up at the Pasha's place. This reminds the female missionary in her memoirs of the Scottish independence leader, Sir William Wallace's head, and later pauses at a door where an old patient of hers was on guard, waiting on one of the robbers confined there. The guard asks whether she likes to look at them, and she says, yes. As Scottish missionaries interacted with the already existing marginal spaces of Izmir, such as prisons, epidemic-infected spaces, and poor sections of the Jewish quarter, they also contribute to the creation of marginal spaces, such as the Jewish Christian Church, a deeply marginal and an intolerable space in the eyes of the Jewish leaders. The church was formed in 1894 by Abraham Levi, who had been converted while lying in the Beaconsfield Memorial Hospital. Number of heads of families in the church was 64, but half of them withdrew on account of persecution. Until now, I have mentioned mostly public spaces and Scots' relationship with them. What about the private spaces and dwellings of the Jewish residents of Izmir? In this regard, I should introduce you to Beaconsfield Memorial Hospital, the main building of the Scottish mission in Izmir, which enabled Scots' immense amount of mobility into private spheres. Beaconsfield Memorial Hospital opened in 1882 with Dr. Reverend Prinsky Scott as the director, and himself was a converted Jew. The hospital was named after Benjamin Disraeli, who was a British statesman of the Conservative Party and twice served as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He was also known to be a Jewish convert to Christianity with Sephardic Jewish ancestry. The hospital was found in Mortakia near Rue de Melez, right next to the Armenian quarter. Today we know this region as Kahramanlar. It was strategically crucial location for the missionaries since it was at the midway between two poor Jewish quarters. And once a fashionable street among the upper classes of the city, Rue de Meles lost its popularity when the promenade became fashionable, the Quai. Scottish missionaries benefited from this abrupt urban transformation and process of marginalization by buying a big house with a garden at a reasonable price. In short time, Beaconsfield Memorial Hospital became a small sanctuary. Although the numbers here seem a bit exaggerated, it has been reported that during the first 5 years of the operations, 50,000 Jews visited the hospital and the small dispensary. The hospital and the mission buildings were destroyed in the Great Fire of 1922, and missionary operations ended. Until the end, Beaconsfield Memorial operated as a gateway to Scottish missionaries' entry into the lives of Jews. In fact, the mission's medical character was the key for access. Individuals' consultation about a past or present disease enabled missionaries to learn more about the family. As 3 days a week, they perceived patients at the dispensary, and on alternate days, missionaries visited Jews at their homes. Also, continuing successes in medical treatments encouraged Jews to talk more about the missions among their social circles, with a hint of supernatural most of the time. For example, Reverend Scott reports that a simple removal of a polypus from a young Jewish girl's nose evolved into a wondrous tale of missionaries taking a fish out of a girl's nose. And the lack of medical knowledge, even for basic wounds, among the locals, turned simple medical procedures into wonders. In this case, locals were applying cheese on open wounds to remove the maggots. Another case is about a young Jewish man who attempted to commit suicide by swallowing a large dose of chloride. Scottish missionaries went to his house and used a stomach pump and the usual antidotes. The stomach pump was seen as a marvel, and Jews accompanied Reverend Scott to fully inspect a curious medical instrument, which was called by the Jews in Judeo-Spanish, La Última Esperanza del Estómago, the last hope of the stomach. Next day, Reverend Scott was a famous man among the Jews. Also, from another case, we learned that female missionaries had access to female Jewish spaces. It has been recorded in an 1899 missionary report that female missionaries in Izmir bought embroideries and silks to be sold in the Great Assembly in Edinburgh. In course of an hour or two, almost the whole of the articles were gone, and reports the missionary. And the report ends informing that a great many orders were given for the next assembly. Just to collect all my findings, I believe that a missionary's access into inner circles of the residents depended on gender, nationality, age, social status, linguistic skills, and being an Israelite or not. And with every patient, the Scottish medical mission exerted a marked influence over the Jews of Izmir, especially among the poor. So one might ask, where is the Christian teaching in all of this? Jewish patients listened to excerpts from the Bible as they waited at the dispensary, and they were given Bibles in Judeo-Spanish and were told that the real healer was not the Reverend Scott, but the Christ himself. According to Scott's narrative, patients left with kind feelings towards Christianity and a desire to know the source of Christian benevolence. And based on my archival findings in the case of Reverend Scott, his Christian missionary identity was overshadowed by the mission's charitable acts and was an ally as Jews sought for ways of survival. As a result, this gave him and his fellow missionaries a great deal of access and mobility within the city. Before concluding, I would like to point out that Scottish missionary archives still wait to be explored by Ottoman historians, as these records give snapshots of the lived reality in the case of lack of access to first-person narratives by the residents of Izmir, either Jew, Greek, Armenian, or Muslim. Eurocentric and Orientalist and sometimes exaggerated accounts of the records might be a topic for another talk. And all things considered, under constant change during the 19th century, marginalized by their community and with limited access to solidarity networks, most of poor Jews of Izmir lived on the margins of charity as well as on the fringe of society. In this context, Scott's entrance into most intimate spheres of local Jews tell us an important story, a story of exclusion and inclusion, marginalization, and acceptance. I believe that we still need alternative models in order to reveal nuances within prevailing paradigms and entangled histories of Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Muslims in Izmir at a time when non-elite histories are becoming a crucial topic in the academic world. Thank you.